As the global advertising industry braces for another year of disruption, few voices carry as much weight or candor as Sir Martin Sorrell. In this episode of Storyboard 18, we sit down with the founder of Monks and executive chairman of S4 Capital during his India visit for a wide-ranging conversation on what lies ahead for agencies, clients, and platforms. From the real implications of the Omnicom-IPG deal and AI-led job churn to India's rising global clout under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the enduring power of big tech platforms and why the industry's crisis is more nuanced than it appears, Sorrell offers an unvarnished view of advertising's shifting economics as 2026 comes into focus.
Welcome, Sir Martin.
That wasn't a very cheerful introduction. It made it sound very, very gloomy. I think you probably have to distinguish a little bit as to what's going on. I mean, the industry, ironically, in light of your introduction, is growing at about 8 or 9 or 10%. But, you know, I think commentators, if I can be so bold as yourself, tend to paint everything with the same brush. And really, you've got to look at two industries. I mean, you group together the advertising industry as one, and really there are two things going on. One is a traditional media industry which is going south, and the other is a digital media industry which is going north. Overall, you put the two together, they're growing at about probably 8 or 9% in 25, and probably a very similar rate in 26. So it's not as gloomy as you paint, but you've got to divide it into two pieces. There's 300, the overall industry last year was about $1 trillion. This year will have been about 1.1 trillion, and next year probably about 1.2. So easy maths to think about. But if you take the $1 trillion, there's 300 billion that's going south, the traditional industry, the Warner Brothers Discovery that Paramount and Netflix are scrapping over at the minute. And what's going on there is it indicates that that industry is under huge pressure. If you don't have live sport, you're declining in terms of ad revenues in that 300 billion by about 10 or 15%. If you do have live sport, maybe by 0 to 5%. And the digital piece, which is the other 700 billion, dominated by Google at 250 billion, by Meta at 150, by Amazon at 60, and by TikTok outside China, probably about 40 billion. So those four platforms, 3 Western plus 1 from the East operating in the West, account for 500 billion out of the trillion and 500 billion out of the 700 billion that is in digital and is growing at 10, 15 or 20% depending on which platform you're talking about. So I think you have to be a little bit more nuanced about how you look at the industry. There's a part that's declining and there's a part that's growing.
But do you think it's a rational consolidation that is happening or the restructuring? How do you foresee 2026 to be as we enter into a new phase where AI-driven marketing and e-commerce ecosystem is growing at a very large speed?
That 300 billion I mentioned, which is declining, is basically what the holding companies are scrapping over. The problem that they face is it's an old model, a multi-brand model, maybe we can talk about that has been sort of outdistanced, outmaneuvered by what's happening in a digital world. But the roots of their revenues are really in that 300 billion, which is under pressure, not in the 700 billion, which is growing. Publicis and maybe to a lesser extent Havas probably are prospering better or doing better, growing their revenues, not hugely, but slightly, because they have more exposure to digital and data and probably have better strategies worked out. Maybe there's something in the Parisian water as well that makes them better. But they have fared better. The other four, including IPG, which is now part of Omnicom, now reduced to 3, along with Dentsu and WPP, remain under huge pressure because probably 35, 40, 45% of their revenues still come from that 300 billion that is under huge pressure. So I think you have to make a distinction between the two. The problem in the digital side is the platforms are growing, as I say, by 10, 15 or 20%, but those platforms are starting to invest more and more heavily in capital expenditure around data and increase and energy and AI capacity. So they're spending probably this year or next year well over $500 billion between the hyperscalers, the so-called hyperscaler platforms, are spending well over $500 billion. I think the latest forecast for next year is about $530 billion on capex around AI expansion, around data centers, and around energy. So they're making huge investments in those areas. I mean, what's really interesting is you have two companies now which are valued at about $25 billion. You have Publicis at around that level, and you have Omnicom around that level. You then drop down to Dentsu at around 6 or 7 billion, and WPP at 4, and then Havas at 1.5. So you've got a huge difference between that sort of duopoly there of Publicis and Omnicom, both at $25 billion each. And then you drop down to Dentsu at 6 or 7. So there's a huge difference. Now, what the market's signaling, and when you look at the relative sizes of Dentsu and indeed WPP, is the market is saying either Publicis and Omnicom were overvalued, doubtful, because the multiples appear to be quite cheap, or the other assets are undervalued. So Dentsu International probably undervalued, WPP probably undervalued, but the question is whether anybody has the courage to leap in at that scale and make that investment with that complexity and with the shadow or cloud of AI and its implications for the organizational structure.
So how do you predict 2026? Is it a year for the scale or specializations like boutiques and the smaller agencies
Well,
in these?
I think in theory, the smaller companies should have an advantage. You have two big bananas, Omnicom and IPG, merging. Here in India, I mean, I've been here for 72 hours, and there's a lot of confusion about, just taking India as an example, about the structure. Actually, interestingly, IPG in India is quite prominent and strong with brands like an FCB and media brands, and the other FCB I think is going to disappear in their restructuring. The people who have emerged at the top of the combined operation, I've heard doubts, maybe this is just people and gossip in the industry, have expressed doubts about their abilities and the fact that other people have been sidelined, or people from IPG have been sidelined, because the dominant force appears to be, is Omnicom. It's not a merger, it's a takeover of IPG by Omnicom. So there will be a lot of discombobulation. 26 will be the first year where the two companies combine, and it'll take 26 and 27 for it all to be sorted out. I mean, I hear the clients here are I use the word discombobulated. They're discombobulated. They haven't been briefed on the combination and who's going to be servicing their accounts, and if there are conflicts, how those conflicts are going to be.
So we also saw that S4 reported a revenue softness.
Yeah.
So how do you calibrate, how do you reframe or retarget your KPIs and
Well,
margins?
the thing we're wrestling with is what I mentioned before. Half of our revenues come from the tech companies. They come from Google. They come from what we call night shift, because we're NDA'd as to who the others are. It comes from Meta, it comes from T-Mobile and Amazon. These companies that I mentioned before are putting huge amounts of money into capex rather than opex, and that's what we're struggling with at the moment. The other thing is AI adoption.
You mentioned about restructuring and work disruption, client disruptions happening because of IPG and Omnicom merger. In India as well, we are seeing a lot of clients complaining about the clarity being not there. Do you expect more such clarity in who's working for whom, and how do you look at the brands
I think
to come in?
To be fair, when you take two businesses at that scale, as I said, with more than 100,000 people, even with the reduction in number of people, there's bound to be a lack of clarity, and it's going to take at least 2 years to sort it out. You can't, whilst the regulators are looking at it, which they have been for 1 year, you can't mold the business together. You can use some clean rooms and consultants to think about how you bring it together, but it's very difficult to do it, sort of in isolation. Now, interestingly, they've just got regulatory approval. They're going into a budget year. They both have calendar years as their financial years. So actually the timing is quite interesting for them to put their budgets together. I'm sure they're busily doing that in Palm Beach at the moment, and looking at how they can put it together. But it is very difficult to give them, to be somewhat sympathetic. I mean, you can't sit in Palm Beach and make these decisions with ease. You have to do it on a country, they probably operate in as 100 or so countries. You have to do it country by country, and that's quite difficult to do. So there will be confusion. There will be clients who say, I haven't been consulted. There will be people who say, we haven't been consulted and we're not in the right position.
So do you expect more account reviews to come in for
Yes,
the Omnicom clients?
Yeah.
And I mean, be it global or in India or APAC, how do you look at it?
I would say generally that would be the case. I mean, I just put to one side mergers of any significance. I think the real, if you look at what's happening in the world, and as I say, economic growth a little bit under pressure globally. We were growing by more than 3% globally. We're now growing by less than 3%. Inflation is more stubborn, as central bankers will attest. They haven't brought down interest rates as fast as people thought they would do. They're coming down, but they're still higher than we were used to. And then, as a result of that, a result of slower growth, higher inflation, higher interest rates, that's going to put pressure on companies, and they will be looking for ways of improving their top line and improving their efficiency. Add on top of that structural changes like Omnicom and IPG and potentially other things, if I'm wrong, then you would expect to see quite a significant amount of turbulence.
Right. When we look at 2025, did the agency industry finally accept that scale alone is no longer a competitive advantage, or are we heading into 2026 repeating the same consolidation playbook just with fewer brands, fewer people and more AI?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think the answer to your question is people will still believe that scale is important. I think scale is important in that declining 300 billion. Scale is not necessarily the determining factor in that growing 700 billion. In the digital world, it's this and data, data and distribution, and this that count. It's not about scale. Krakowski, who basically was the CEO of IPG, who basically gave up. I mean, he basically surrendered. He did either con or encourage John Wren to make the move on IPG this time last year, which was a remarkable achievement. And we got a big golden parachute as a result of it, as did the other two people who negotiated the deal. There were 3 people who got gold parachutes. But what was interesting was his argument had been, I need more scale. I had a conversation with him where he was very pessimistic about all the, this is before he sold the company, where he was very pessimistic about the prospects of each of the individual brands within IPG, with the exception of media brands, which he said needed more scale. So the whole of his argument, and this would have been about July of last year, just after Cannes of last year, so about July of last year, August of last year. His whole, before they announced the merger later on in November of last year, whenever it was, the whole argument that he had was, I need more scale. There are people who still believe that. I don't think it is as important as it has been, and particularly it's only important, in my view, or really important in that 300 billion. I don't think in the 700 billion, where algorithms are the key, and it's nous and knowledge and brain power plus data and distribution that are important, I don't think that scale necessarily wins. So it's interesting. I think the one thing that the IPG merger or the Omnicom takeover does is gives them a very strong position in America. 57% certainly before when they announced the deal, so something like 60% of their revenues come out of North America, and that gives them huge control and focus. But it's really important in that 300 billion, the stuff that people are fighting over WBD for, or when Bob Iger went back to Disney, or when Brian Roberts at Comcast brings Comcast together, now splitting it apart. So they're wrestling with the share of the 300 billion and then trying to leverage those brands in the 700 billion where you can see the growth.
So we saw a lot of disruption because of external factors, be it President Donald Trump imposing tariffs. I want to understand more from you about two global leaders, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Well, Trump is an acquired taste. People like some of the stuff that he does and don't like some of the stuff that he does. And there are some things that he says that I would wholeheartedly agree. For example, he said a few months ago that the Chinese think about the long term. Companies, which we've touched on in this interview, think about 3 months, and that's too short. And he said we should get rid of quarterly reporting. Maybe report every 6 months or every year if you're a listed company, and I think that's right. So he comes out with some jewels. Now, do I necessarily agree that tariffs are a good thing from a global point of view? Maybe from a US point of view. He can point to, he has a long-term deficit problem, and imposing tariffs and getting a better balance of trade might be one of the ways that he thinks, and Scott Bessent thinks, they can address that issue in the longer term. We'll have to see how that plays out. As a globalist, do I think tariffs are necessarily a good thing for the world? No. I think free trade is a better way for us to develop policy. So there are things that Trump says and does, but you have to hand it to him. The guy is a genius in terms of, he had one term, he lost in inverted commas. He would claim he didn't lose the election to intervening election in Biden, and won it again against a lot of what people said. I mean, the first election in 2016, nobody gave him a chance. He won that election, and I think the second time around, people were hesitant to give him, some were hesitant to give him a chance. I don't think Kamala Harris was a particularly effective opponent, a Democratic opponent, and he won again. And so you have to hand it to him from a political point of view, whether you call it populist or whatever. He appeals not so much to the West Coast and the East Coast, but the stuff in the middle, the stuff that Elon Musk always refers to as, the flyover US. And I think you have to hand it to him that politically he's been extremely astute. On Modi, from my perspective, he's one of the best leaders that we see in the world. If you were asking me to identify the strongest leaders in the world, he would be right up there. I think he understands brand India. He understands projecting India's influence and power around the world. So I think he's done a great job in terms of promoting and developing the Indian brand. I mean, if I think back to the UK, Cameron and Clegg came in for a lot of criticism from some quarters, but David Cameron, who was originally a PR guy, publicly, he understands that. He understood brand UK, and interestingly, he and subsequently Clegg, when they were jointly leading a government, put into place advertising programs, the Great Britain campaign, which actually are models for sort of country branding and country advertising, I think now, because what they did was they insist that every minister obeyed the template they put together. So I think Modi is really interesting from the point of view of promoting brand India, gaining respect for brand India, and the growth of the Indian economy and its position in the world is forever improving. And as I said to you before, by 2050, it'll be the third largest economy in the world. It's already the world's most populous country. That doesn't mean there aren't challenges. You know, traveling around Mumbai is, as we know, is an effort. But it's a country in transition. The problem is it has existing infrastructure, which has to be taken care of at the same time as you're building new infrastructure. You know, I was recently in Abu Dhabi and in Saudi, in the UAE and Saudi, and the advantage they have is they're building new infrastructure, but they don't have to dismantle a lot of old infrastructure that they've been saddled with. So it is totally new, and if you look at what they are doing on a smaller scale, but in those regions, it's quite incredible the vision that, for example, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi, or the UAE, the seven UAE states have, is quite extraordinary.
Interesting. On that note, thank you for sharing those insights with us.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure
Thanks for
to
the
interview you,
opportunity.
Sir Martin. Thank you so much.